This is Pantheon Plus, a podcast where we go beyond tights and flights to explore other genres and movies from the past. Each month we'll have a theme. This month we're on the road again for Road Trip Month, and we're on the last stop. And this week we picked a Goofy movie from 1995.
From Walt Disney Pictures, Max is the most popular kid in school.
Max! Max!
His girlfriend's a babe.
Call you later.
Okay.
His best bud is cool.
It's the Leaning Tower of Cheesa.
There's only one problem. His dad's goofy. Morning, son!
Dad!
It's Goofy and Max. In the movie, Siskel and Ebert give 2 thumbs up.
You look just like I did at your age.
Please don't say that, Dad.
A Goofy movie, rated G. Now playing at a theater near you.
My name is Brian DeBrain. You can find me on Twitter at Brian DeBrain. You can find additional episodes of this podcast through Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and all your favorite podcast apps through the real world. We strongly encourage you to leave a 4 or 5-star review so as to help people discover this show and the great work that the folks at the real world are doing. If you would like to interact with us or send feedback, you can do so by following us on Twitter at Hero Pantheon. My co-host for this week and every week during this trip has been Jerome Q-Son. He can be found on Twitter at JeromeC1985. And last week, we stopped at the Tommy Boy Stop, 1995. I think it came out at the end of March. Coincidentally, a week later, another road trip movie about fathers and sons comes out. And it's a Goofy movie. And this one's has a weird kind of history with Disney. Because this was kind of in the middle portion of the 90s where it was the end of the whole Disney Renaissance and into this whole, I don't know what kind of era you want to call it, but it's definitely not the greatest, you know what I mean? It's not as good as the first half of the 90s. And people credit that to Jeffrey Katzenberg, who took over the movie animation departments of Disney in around 85, I think. And it's because of him that led to the Renaissance with, Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, Lion King, all those things. Like, it's all because of him. Oh, well, people credit to him because of, the way he led the department through that era, basically rising it from not necessarily obscurity, because you can say that, I don't know, the first big Disney era ended around, I don't know, early 70s, and that some of those movies between the 70s and 80s were not as memorable. But he rose them from, that kind of, not necessarily dead, but they weren't dead, but, I mean, they were pretty close to dead at that time, during that era for Disney, but he got him out of it. And for some reason, he just didn't get along with Michael Eisner towards this time. He kind of got outed by Michael Eisner, and this was kind of like his last movie that he was producing, quote unquote, or releasing. And unfortunately, because of that relationship with Eisner did not put any money in the budget for marketing or merchandising. All they had were like Burger King toys, and that's pretty much it. And if you look back, there's hardly any merchandising, any advertising. Lion King had a shitload, Aladdin had a shitload, Beauty and the Beast had a shitload. A Goofy movie gets no love in the merchandising end, and I think that really, I don't know. It's kind of messed up, but at the same time, it kind of endeared it to become this cult classic, kind of, because no one gave it the love when it first came out, but then VHS kind of helped it out, and now it's become this millennial cult classic.
It has definitely become a cult classic. Recently, SlashFilm.com did an oral history on the power line scene at the end of this movie, so I definitely think that this movie has an audience. And for those of you who are curious about some Disney history, so to speak, especially as it pertains to the Renaissance that took place in the late 80s and in the first half of the 90s, there is a documentary called Waking Sleeping Beauty on Disney Plus that I would strongly recommend. It's a really short watch, and it gets into some of the issues. Jeffrey Katzenberg is discussed extensively since he was such a major part of it, and I think that Jeffrey Katzenberg is one of those people who is always identified as kind of a genius of the entertainment industry, and you could certainly make the argument that Disney did some tremendous work in those 10 years. But I think when you look at some of Katzenberg's creative output since then, I think there's a lot to be desired. Do we even do we talk about Quibi, or does Quibi even exist except in your head? Because that's Katzenberg for you.
So that's that app thing where they shows on an app, right? The one that kind of failed because no one gave a shit.
Well, it hasn't completely failed yet, but it is certainly not doing well. I think what's also worth pointing out about this movie is that it has a very strong connection to the Disney afternoon show, Goof Troop, which, Brian, how dare you not mention that show? And number two, that is a banger of a theme song, too.
See, that's the thing. I don't know. I wasn't a Goof Troop guy. I was definitely a DuckTales guy. Uh, some Darkwing Duck, but then I don't know. I guess it was just the way that everything was just timed out in the tune hour. I don't know, because I would never watch Goof Troop, but I would always be DuckTales and Darkwing Duck for some reason. But I don't know what it is. Maybe it was just my local thing, but that does play a part of it because doing the research for this, I didn't realize how many connections were actually to the original show. I mean, I knew because what I did know is that these characters appeared in different like VHS stuff before because I'd recognize the faces and stuff like PJ and his dad. Like I know those were recurring characters, but I didn't realize how deep of a connection it made to the other shows. But yeah, I mean, I guess that was the whole thing, right? They wanted to make this big connection and make this big movie to connect it all right, but then it just got no love with the merchandising. So I guess that's probably adds to why just not a lot of people went out to see this. It did decent money, but it did not do massive Disney numbers that probably Katzenberg had envisioned. But he just kind of got screwed out of it, and then they kind of got forced to produce this movie when he left. So that's kind of the situation, and that's why everything was kind of soured on in the merchandising, I think.
I mean, it's really unfortunate that a movie can get abandoned like this just based on the whims of a particular administration, and regardless of one's feelings on a movie itself, I think it's just kind of crappy when movies get abandoned, and movies are still getting abandoned, Brian. Because I mean, just look at the tumultuous release schedule of New Mutants as no further of an example than right there. So this is something that's still going on, and Disney is still very much involved in this because of corporate takeovers and mergers and buyouts and all that jazz. This is stuff that is still very much going on.
Yeah, and I don't know how to feel about Michael Eisner because, like, I've seen those YouTube docs, and I remember some of those ABC Wide World of Disney stuff back in the day, and he seemed so nice and like actually cared about the product. But his era was like, I'm not a big fan of Hunchback of Notre Dame, and he puts it over a lot. He put a lot of effort into that one, and I don't know, it just his era doesn't speak to me as, or as probably as most to everyone else, but I don't know what it is. Maybe it's just his demeanor kind of adds to it. I don't know what it is with Michael Eisner. He's just got this look on his face that doesn't make me trust him too much. I don't know what it is. But moving on, a little quick note here. We mentioned that early Renaissance period. This was supposed to be released in the summer of 1994, actually, but the production got delayed. So instead, they put in Lion King, which is interesting because summer of '94 was huge for me when it came because it was Lion King. But if Lion King didn't come out that summer, then Angels in the Outfield would maybe be a bigger movie to me because I remember that and Angels in the Outfield were big movies in '94. Do you remember that summer in particular? Because I remember a double feature on a summer camp day that blew my mind.
I do not necessarily remember Angels in the Outfield coming out. I mean, of course, I've seen that movie a bajillion times on VHS and whatnot, but I don't remember that movie being a seminal of an experience. Lion King definitely was. That is definitely a movie that I saw in the theaters in the summer of 1994, and it was a big deal. And it's still probably my favorite animated Disney movie that's ever been made. I might even like that more than any of the Pixar movies, quite frankly. But if you want to go read more, go read my my 100 favorite movies of all time. Lion King is prominently featured on that list. You can go check that. And by the end of the year, you'll be able to see where it ranks compared to other Disney and Pixar movies. What I think is most interesting is that at this point in 1995, what you are witnessing is the descent of Disney Animation Studios as they are slowly going down. And you see this develop over the next few years with Pocahontas and The Hunchback of Notre Dame and Atlantis and so many of these movies that did not necessarily do as well or were not as critically acclaimed as Beauty and the Beast and The Little Mermaid and Aladdin and The Lion King. So what you're seeing is that slow descent, but also around this time, 95, 96, you got the slow ascent of Pixar with Toy Story and Bug's Life and just all the movies that they've been able to make. And eventually, I think you get to a point where Disney Animation has another renaissance, so to speak, because of Frozen. I think it's one of those movies that probably it gets overrated in some cases because Let It Go has just been played to death in so many households across this country, especially if you have kids. But I think it's underrated in that I think it resurrected Disney animation once again. And I think that we are seeing the residuals from that even to this day, that Disney animation is still such a factor, even though they're unfortunately not doing 2D animation. I'm hoping that at some point we can get some straight, even if it's straight to Disney Plus, but we can get some 2D animation again. But I mean, I think you even look at this movie and I think you see some of those residuals because I think you do get that distinctive animation style. I think you get some pretty good music in this movie. I think that there's still some heart that is also there that you don't necessarily get when Jeffrey Katzenberg transfers over to DreamWorks and they start producing the Shrek movies. That's what separated Disney and Pixar from a lot of other animation studios, is that they really put the heart of these stories first.
Yeah, and it's that was very well put because you can see it clearly as soon as he leaves. I mean, the stories just change. And you mentioned the crazy off the wall awesome soundtrack for Frozen, but the soundtrack to this movie has really grown on people. Like it I don't know what it is, man, but I guess the idea of mixing Bobby Brown, Prince, and Michael Jackson to create the character of Powerline, that I mean, it's gonna affect people because they went out of their way to make a really awesome, catchy soundtrack, and that really helps this movie, and especially its cult status, because I think people more so love the soundtrack than the actual movie itself at this point, and I think that's I don't know. It's just something about that '90s pop style that just resonates with people, especially when it sounds like Bobby Brown, even though it's not Bobby Brown. And Bobby Brown was supposed to be the voice of Powerline, and he did record some songs, but it's Bobby Brown, and he had some substance abuse issues amongst other things at this time. So yeah, he ended up getting dropped, and they replaced him with Tevin Campbell. Tevin Campbell was actually 17 at the time, so that was really interesting. I didn't even know he was that young. I didn't really know who Tevin Campbell was, but he started popping up on my Pandora playlist of the '90s R&B station. So I started looking into his career, and yeah, he's got some bangers too. But it seems like everyone just remembers the two Powerline songs from him, and it's kind of his like legacy. And what's really interesting is that this wasn't really embraced as like a cult classic by Disney until recently, because like what really set the stage, I think, is at the 2015 the 20th anniversary reunion was held at D23, right? So they put him in this room. I think it was like a 500 500 people capacity room, and like 1,000 people showed up, and like it would just overwhelm them, and no one expected that kind of response because like the whole cast was there. It was a reunion. They had Tevin Campbell come out and perform, and it kind of outdrew all the other panels that day. And then I think that's what kind of like made people or Disney realize, hey, there's a love for this movie. And then 2 years later, it's 2017, and I find myself at like this uh, Goofy movie screening at the El Capitan Theater, and they got Max dressed up in there in the suit and everything, and he's dancing, and all these kids are there. And this was like a Sunday. Like I went bowl of morning before night three on Sunday. I think there was like probably 50 people in the theater, and there was like kids and like adults, and some just adults. But this movie just kind of like transcends, and it's very generational. Like it connects very well. And there's something about the music that just gets everyone dancing, and everyone was dancing and singing along to the songs, man. Everyone knew it. So there's something about it. I think that's what really stands out about this movie. And I mean, yeah, the father and son tale, and we'll get to that and what still works, and how, we are scared to become our fathers, you know what I mean? And that's kind of like one of those universal things. But I don't know, just something about this music that's just unbelievably catchy. And even to this day, I'm still like on road trips with my friends when we still take road trips. we're still playing the Powerline stuff because it brings you in a good mood. It's nostalgic, and it's a really good road song too. But I don't know. How do you feel about the soundtrack? Because I think it's banging like crazy.
I think the soundtrack is undoubtedly the strongest aspect of this movie, and you're right. All of the songs are extremely catchy. I think the Powerline ones especially, but even the songs that Goofy and Max sing, I think, are really solid. Are they as memorable as the ones that are in the Disney classics? Absolutely not. But I think for that time period, I think they're absolutely appropriate. And I think they're still they're very catchy, and I think that's why this and the aspects of this movie that work. A lot of it has to do with the soundtrack and the music. I will say that when I first heard Powerline's voice, I actually thought it was Michael Jackson. And if it was, we would not be able to review this movie because Michael Jackson would have probably used this to groom kids. And I know there was an issue with the Simpsons episode. That's why it's not on Disney Plus. So it's really weird to think that Bobby Brown and Michael Jackson are the inspirations because those two gentlemen are canceled, and probably we should not be listening to their music anymore. Unfortunately, Prince did not live long enough to be canceled, so I guess that's kind of a good thing. And every time I think of Prince, I always think of the Kevin Smith story that he told in An Evening with Kevin Smith. So that is to me. For all of the wonderful music that Prince has put out in the world, I always think of that Kevin Smith story first.
Me too, and that just tells you where we're at in terms of when we watched that DVD. But the other interesting note, you mentioned Prince. They recorded the songs for Powerline at Paisley Park, man, which is just it's crazy. It's just the way that they put this together and the amount of thought they put in the soundtrack. The fact that they went out of their way to record at Paisley Park, where Prince records all his music and lived. It just, everything is connected, right? It's just crazy how they did that. I was just kind of blown away. And still to this day, and even in the rebooted DuckTales, they're still using the music and referencing loosely a Goofy movie, man. And still, like, they have Powerline stuff in the background. I don't know. I feel like with Disney Plus, they can do something with this. I still haven't seen the sequel because I really don't care to watch the sequel. I read the synopsis and, like, I'm not really interested. But I don't know. Maybe they can kind of rehash this and get back to this, but. We're talking about what still works about this. We talked about the catchy pop soundtrack. It's awesome. I think the car scenes still really resonate with me. I've had those disconnected moments with my father back in the day on like random fishing trips that I didn't want to go on that he insisted on going on, and we've all been there. Fathers and sons just really hits home. There's this disconnect, man, because sometimes fathers just have this tendency to kind of like project what they want onto their sons, and the sons don't even want that, and now you have this total disconnect of what both want, and then you have this breakdown of communication, and you see that exactly when they're not talking to each other at the beginning of the road trip. So all that stuff really hits home, and this is of course not just fathers and sons, but mothers and daughters, same thing, and vice versa. It just that combination with parents and kids and that disconnect. I thought they really nailed it, especially with this whole idea that, Goofy is way, I don't know, he's just so from a different time period. And they made it really like almost like two generations back. You know what I mean? Because he's still living like he's in the 50s and 60s and he's not that smart. But Max is definitely a kid of the 90s. He's hip, he's smart, and he's sarcastic. So there's that great relationship there that you can kind of work on and build on. It works throughout the movie, and they kind of have to resolve that. And by the end of the movie, they resolve that, but they have this understanding of one another, a much better understanding, and they're able to communicate better. Not that was the whole message of the movie. Not that was great, especially the fact that the whole idea is that he's trying to drag Max on this road trip because Max gets in trouble at school, but the fact that they never get to the actual lake and they ended up going to L.A. instead to get Max on stage to say hi to Roxanne. I think that showed you that the whole idea of going to the lake was they were never going to the lake in the first place. That was never going to be the intention. So I thought that was really good because I watching this two or three times, it's like, man, they never go to the lake. They kind of build it up, and then it's like that's not the point. The point is for them to bond at the end, and they don't need the lake. So that was a good message, and then them, performing on stage, all that stuff was great. So I think the car scenes work really well, especially for fathers and sons, mothers and daughters, man. There's always going to be those scenes in the car where there's just silence and the parent wants to help so bad, but the best think they could do at the moment is just sit there in silence.
Yeah, I mean, I can certainly understand why people would embrace those scenes. I think so many Disney movies deal in fairy tales, and they don't they don't always connect directly to people. And I think that in this movie, they're definitely going more for that vibe of trying to connect with reality. And I could certainly see this working for kids. I don't think that this movie works for me as an adult. I mean, there are certainly aspects to the movie that I do enjoy, especially I think the music. I think the scene where Max and Goofy finally have the big conversation when they're sitting on the car and they're going down the river, so to speak, and I think that's the scene that works. But even at 80 minutes, I think it felt a little bit repetitive, and it felt just like these two people were just on a total disconnect. And I think the fact that Goofy does seem even so much older than the 90s, and Max is so 90s. I mean, it was almost to the point of getting to like Poochie from the Simpsons level territory. I don't know what your thoughts on that were, but that's kind of how Max felt to me at times, and I was kind of annoyed with both of them at a certain point because of that. So I think this is definitely a movie that is much more designed for younger people, and I think as an adult, I think it's just much harder to enjoy this. And I mean, there's so many 90s aspects to this movie that I could cite, and that's undoubtedly a huge part of it is a lot of the stuff with Max and what he's trying to do with Roxanne, which always kind of boils over into creepy territory. I think we are at a point in the 90s where you see a lot of these kinds of movies where these young boys are doing everything to get the attention of these girls, these young women, and it always crosses over into borderline gaslight territory, and couldn't help but think of that. And it's worth noting that Kelly Martin is the voice of Roxanne. And for those of you who may have watched the television show ER, there is a very specific memory that I have of Kelly Martin on that show that I'm not going to spoil here. But every time I see her name, I can't think of anything else except that.
Well, now you got me curious because my friend is a really huge ER mark and he's seen every season, so I'm gonna have to text him about that one. But I can see where you see, it doesn't really connect you as an adult, but uh, because there's still a lot of scenes that really have like, don't really age well. But in terms of the stuff that still works for me in like the high school sense, I did like the thing at the beginning where they took over the auditorium and did this show. But credit to Pauly Shore. He was the voice of Bobby, the camera guy who was obsessed with cheese and Cheese Whiz. I thought that was, random things like that. That's such a '90s thing too. The whole cheese thing in the mouth. And yeah, I did that when I was a kid in the '90s. No, I'm not gonna lie. But he didn't want to take credit for the role. He did the Robin Williams thing where he didn't want to like put his name on it and like take the. I figured you put Pauly Shore in a Disney movie in '95, you're gonna get some some head scratching, some rolling eyes. So I guess that's probably the reason why he wanted to take himself off. But a nice little cameo for what it was. I still enjoy the Bigfoot scene despite how stupid it is. But goddamn, just like it's simple things like that. He's not talking. It's physical comedy, and you're laughing at Bigfoot because he's experiencing new things. Then when he's dancing to the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack, I thought that was great. And then that kind of leads into that Hi Dad Soup scene, which is what it is. It still kind of plays cheesy today, but it did have its cute little moment when he spells out Hi Dad at the end. But it was it wasn't quite the resolution they were looking for. That was coming later on top of the car going down the river. But also the scene at the beginning I liked a lot because it's a dream sequence and it's him trying to kiss the girl that he loves, Roxanne, but unfortunately starts turning into his father. And that again, I mentioned that fear of becoming your father. That's one of my things for sure. Like I try to be conscious of that and try not to be my dad who was not necessarily a good person, but it's one of those things. So and I liked it because that sequence is very much inspired by like werewolf movies, and you can see him transform. And at first when you watch that as a kid, you're like, oh, he's just turning into his dad. But when you watch like American Werewolf in London and then watch this afterward, you're you're like, oh yeah, that's definitely a werewolf transformation scene they did, and they did it really subtly. So I like that as well. So and we mentioned the disconnect between parents and kids. The other thing that really I think we have to mention a lot is I've read a lot of articles recently, and a lot of people or a lot of African Americans connect with this movie a lot, especially like the millennial generation because they grew up on this, same time period as us, watching this on VHS. But they see Max as like, them, like a young black kid, and they kind of project that onto him, and they relate to that a lot. And especially when you got Powerline, who's based on these three, you know, depending how you feel, but they are iconic music legends, that shaped the genre of pop music in the 90s, and put that all together, and you got a lot of black millennials relating to this movie a lot, and they see themselves through Max and the eyes of Max and the way that they have those relationships with their father and the whole, the way they were in the 90s, and they relate to that a lot. So I think this is growing in different ways, not just the soundtrack, but for black millennials who just like this movie a lot and relate to it. And then the one thing that really stuck out with me is when the principal, who's played by Wallace Shawn, credit to Wallace Shawn, who's always in great character roles, inconceivable. He, when he's talking on the phone with Goofy, he totally like misdirects the whole situation and paints the picture that Max is this like criminal when he's not, and it's just total like, a rich white dude or which white privilege describing the situation and painting the black person as a criminal when they're not. And this is exactly what he says. Your son started a riot dressed as a gang member, and then eventually this is the kind of thing that would lead him to the electric chair. And I thought, yeah, that's probably what hits home because these poor black millennials are being painted as like criminals by certain racist white people, and then you get this white perspective calling him dressed as a gang member. He's dressed as the dude from Devo, man. So I thought that was very subtle, and it hits home now, especially that we're older, I think.
Yeah, I certainly would not want to take away from the experience of people who do connect with this movie because I think there is a legitimate argument for that to be done. And I think that when you talk about films and movies, you always have your personal opinions and how you feel about them, but it's always really important to never discount how other people feel because movies are somebody's favorite movie is always going to be the one that we're talking about. Somebody out there, their favorite movie is Midnight Run or Tommy Boy or this one. So you never want to discount those experiences. I think that for me, just a lot of this movie just didn't work on me. And I think the high school scenes are a huge part of that. I did not like Pauly Shore in this movie at all. I just don't like Pauly Shore in general. He is the very definition of that 90s comedic style that I just don't think works in 2020. And I think, to an extent, I think the SNL people, it's not necessarily the same, but it is similar in that I don't think a lot of that comedy has aged well as well either. The Bigfoot scene was kind of hit or miss for me. I like the payoff, but some of it was goofy, pun very much intended. I think the opening dream sequence actually does work. It's not subtle, but with a kids movie, I don't think you should necessarily be subtle. And I think just going through that literalization of him turning into his father, I think works out really well and kind of explains what the theme of the movie is going to be. And I think this does show the disconnect of parents and their kids. And I wish that we would get more movies like this that are more for maybe teenagers and adults that would present kind of both perspectives, because I think the one good thing this movie does is it does present Max and Goofy's perspective, or at least it tries to. You could debate whether it's successful or not. I'm a little bit dubious of it, but I think that they are at least trying to present both perspectives and not necessarily say that Goofy is all wrong or Max is wrong, but that they are both trying to live their lives, and it's not always easy. I mean, Wallace Shawn is always a great voice to hear. He has such a distinct voice, and that's why he's perfect for animation. And I want to say that the principal is an exaggeration and not real, but I could totally picture a principal behaving this way, especially if they are principal of a school of mixed races, and he's a white principal yelling at black parents. I could certainly see that being very plausible and having kind of that racial tinge to it. So, yeah, it's hard to call it an exaggeration when you know that this is stuff that is going on right now. So I don't think a lot of the stuff that works for you doesn't necessarily work for me. But again, I do appreciate the fact that this movie does have an audience, and I think that's something that does have to be acknowledged, and that there are lessons to be taken away from this movie that are positive.
Yeah, for sure. And it's still there's some stuff that still doesn't work for me because I think there's like at least 10 minutes missing from the movie that they just didn't even bother to animate because from what I keep reading, they started recording in 92 and didn't stop until like early 95 before the movie even came out. So there reports of all these different scenes they recorded and like Joey Lawrence actually had like I think a voice or two in this movie as like the jock dude, but they just didn't play into it because they didn't bother to animate more of the scenes with him. There's like more of like a more plot to that, and they just got rid of it. So it seems like from the way I perceive it, it's like the moment when Bigfoot falls asleep on the car to when they're in that diner. There's like 10 minutes missing from that at least, or maybe five, and then some other stuff at the high school. But to me, like I do appreciate a short runtime, but it just feels like stuff is literally missing. And then when you read all the stuff they recorded and didn't even bother to put in, yeah, and then read about the merchandising and the amount of money they put into this after Katzenberg left, it all makes sense once you realize it. So I feel like there's still a good portion of this movie that should have been made or like animated, but they just didn't bother. So that really sucks. And I didn't really, still to this day, like I didn't really feel like the Possum Park stuff was really cool. Like you know what I mean? Like I still feel like that kind of stereotype we're making fun of like Southern people in the wrong way, and we just got to get rid of and get past that. We have.
Oh yes, Brian. This is something that I really want to rant about for a few minutes because this is something, and a Goofy movie is certainly not the first to do this, but we constantly see this in movie and television shows. Even a show like The Simpsons, where they have Cletus the Slack-jawed yokel. This is something that they are constantly doing, and then we wonder why people who live in the middle of the country or in the flyover states, we wonder why they hate Hollywood and quote unquote coastal elites. It's because of garbage like this. I mean, this stuff, the way that they portray Southern people, and even Planes, Trains, and Automobiles had a scene like this too, where they were making fun of. It was a person who was very specifically from that area, and they were almost making fun of him. And I think you see this in so many of these movies and TV shows, and it's not right. I think when we talk about stereotypes, we talk about the way that Asian people are stereotyped or the way that black people are stereotyped. But these are also very real stereotypes that need to be addressed, and it needs to stop because I think when you do this kind of stuff, you are creating an image in people's heads of what people in these states are like. And look, there are some very stupid people that live in this country, and all you need to do is go on your local social media feed and find out the people that aren't wearing masks. And you can see that there are a lot of dumb people out there. But I don't think that it is okay to just stereotype, and I think that's what this movie does. And that scene was just very important to me.
Yeah, I have the exact same feelings, and when I watched it as a kid, didn't really think of it. But as I grew older, and that same argument, it's like why no wonder these people in the South don't like Hollywood and liberals and all that stuff. It's shit like this, and like, look, I vote blue and Democrat, but I'm not shitting on Republicans, right? I don't want to do that. And I'm not saying that these people in the South are all Republicans. I'm just saying that these stereotypes create this tension, and we don't need this tension. So let's just kind of portray everyone as like solid equal footing, that we're all let's try to portray us as all smart and just kind of go with that, and on that, based off that assumption, because if we just kind of do these kind of like hick stereotypes, it's just gonna like make things worse and worse. And I know this was 95, but we still see this in a lot of current stuff. So I wanted to point that out too, and I'm glad you realized that too, because I realized this immediately. Like oh god, this is the shit that the southern states hate about Hollywood, and it's very true. So the other thing that didn't work for me was that open road sequence. The song's okay, compared to the other songs, it's probably one of the weakest ones of the soundtrack. But Did you notice all the weird stuff going on? Like, I think Goofy murdered a dude in the construction site when he ran through it. That dead body was talking from the coffin, and I think the nuns. I don't know. Were they the nuns from Airplane, or were they? I don't know what's going on. They look like the nuns from Airplane, and all these weird stuff were going on in the background. And then you see Donald and Mickey on the side of the road. It just felt like that was just so random and stuff. And they were like, okay, we need a musical sequence as we, go off into the adventure. And it just didn't work for me, and it still doesn't work for me. And when I watched this in theaters in 2017, I'm like, did Goofy just kill a guy? And then I guess Max kills a guy too at the end when he launches that dude into the screen. But still, like, I know it's supposed to be Goofy, but come on, man, let's not kill any construction work.
A goofy movie, more like a goofy murder. Am I right?
Yeah, you should have saved one for that, or saved that for the end, man. But
No, no, no. I have something for the end already. So I don't. I had my ending line 20 minutes into this movie, and you're right. That open road sequence is just so bizarre. Having the dead bodies speak, and the murder, and the nuns. It was really, really strange, and I don't know how to feel. How are dead people speaking in the world of Goofy? Are they? I mean, are we going full Evil Dead here, and they have the book and whatnot? Are we going to see Ash at some point? It was very, very weird.
if Disney decided to do zombie movies, then God help us all, because that's probably the next step, and then it'll go straight to Disney Plus. But yeah, just some weird sequences there, and like I mentioned, the short run time and all that kind of thing. Those are the things that overall don't work for me, and you already mentioned yours. Is there anything else you wanted to mention in terms of what doesn't work?
No, I think I covered a lot of the things that worked for you that didn't work for me. I covered that previously, and I mean, I just think that the vibe of this movie just gives off something very 90s, and it's funny because I think Tommy Boy kind of is guilty of the same thing, just giving off a very specific vibe. And I think if they were to make this movie today, I mean, it wouldn't be 2D, it would probably be 3D. But it's just so amazing to me to think of how much Disney has changed in the last 25 years, that what kind of movie would this even be? Would it even be over to go straight to Disney Plus or air on the Disney Channel? Just a lot of things have changed.
For sure. So let's kind of go on to the MVP. I'm going with Kevin Lima, the director. Considering what he had to work with in the power change and the struggles with Katzenberg and Michael Eisner. So he actually went on to do Tarzan, and that's probably, we talked about that lower end of the 90s, but Tarzan is probably like a B level, Disney movie. It's not on the A level, but it's still pretty good. And then he went on to do Enchanted, the live action one, and I actually like that movie a lot. Um, I know it's been 2007, and not a lot of people have talked about it, but I did like the live action aspects of that, combining it with the Disney animation style that he brought to it. So he's got some talent. I don't think he's done anything since then, but maybe he's done some TV stuff. But he's probably just taking it easy considering all the money he's made with Disney. So that's is what it is. So he's my MVP. And best performance, Jason Marsden plays Max. He's a recognizable voice because he's also the voice of, I think, the talking cat in Hocus Pocus. He is also a bit player on Step by Step, not Family Matters, Boy Meets World, and some other stuff. But you'll recognize the voice, and once you see his face, it's like, oh my god, it's that dude from TGIF on every Friday on ABC.
Yeah, I would agree with you on Jason Marsden. I think he is the best performer in this movie. I think for me, the MVP, it's so clear to me. It's really hard because there are so many songwriters. So I'm just going to list some of the people who wrote the various songs and composed music. So the score for a Goofy movie was provided by Carter Burwell. There are the songs primarily performed by R&B singer Tevin Campbell. And some of the other writers included Rosie Gaines, Patrick DeReamer, Roy Freeland, Tom Snow, Jack Feldman, Aaron Lohr. They wrote various songs, and for me, again, the soundtrack is the strongest portion. So if I'm going to say that, then I have to give it to the songwriters, and I wanted to mention their names and give them the credit that they deserve for creating a fantastic soundtrack. So all of those people that I just mentioned, performers and songwriters, they are the collective MVPs of this movie.
I'm glad you went with that one because I didn't expect that answer, but that was a great answer because those names deserve to be read out loud and appreciated because they really bring the cult status out of this movie for sure. So that's going to wrap up our road trip here in September. Uh, it's been fun, man, because we got to explore some comedies from the 80s, comedies from the 90s, Disney animation and its transitional point. So all that stuff wrapped up with the traditional, tropes of having a road trip and all the kind of crazy shenanigans you can get into. So the road has ended, and we're switching off to, I guess it's post-apocalyptic month since it's October, and you got some scary things for us, Jerome?
Yeah, I don't know why I was thinking about being in a world that is post-apocalyptic. I don't know what events that have taken place in the last few months could possibly make me think about that. And I did not necessarily want to go the horror route because there are horror movies that have been talked about, reviewed to death, that we could discuss, and I don't necessarily want to. So we're going to go a little bit old school to start. We're going to start with Escape from New York, which is it's not the original a pop post-apocalyptic movie, but it's probably one of the most prominent, and it'll be a chance to talk about the great John Carpenter, as well as the star-making performance of Kurt Russell as an adult. Of course, he was in a lot of Disney movies as a kid, but this is probably his first like adult movie that received a lot of recognition. So we're going to talk about that. Then we are going to do something very different. We're going to talk about Bong Joon-ho's probably his first real notable movie as far as the United States. He, of course, has been a director for about 10 years at this point and has made a number of very good movies that I need to see. But we are going to focus our attention on Snowpiercer as we are spending a lot of time on a train, Brian, in this movie and in the movie that we are reviewing the following week, as we are going to review Train to Busan. I wanted to do a zombie movie. Originally, I was going to do Zack Snyder's Dawn of the Dead, but then I realized that Zack Snyder is a tool, and I would rather literally talk about any other person on this podcast. So we are going to do Train to Busan instead, a movie, Brian, that you have not seen, but I hope that you are emotionally preparing yourself for that one. And then we are going to end with one of the best movies of the decade, regardless of what Matt Waters says, in Mad Max Fury Road. So I guess we are doing kind of a road trip in that movie, too.
Yeah, going from one place to another place and then going back to that place. And that's it. That's Mad Max, but I still love that movie because it's so simple and basic. But yeah, I'm excited because I mean we're gonna get to talk about John Carpenter. We're gonna get to talk about Donald Pleasance. You buried the lead on that one, maybe I don't know because Donald Pleasance is the fucking man. And yeah, I mean Train to Busan. I've always wanted. It's been popping up on Netflix, and then they recently released a sequel, so that's interesting as well. And the timing of that one, so good timing. And then Snowpiercer, I've been wanting to watch that one as well, but this is the right time to watch it now, especially with the show. And we'll talk about Willy Wonka when we talk about that one that week. But and then Mad Max to end it out. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. And October is gonna be crazy, leading into the first week of November, which we're not going to talk about yet.
Absolutely, as it'll be your turn again. And I just wanted to briefly mention, so there are movies that are returning to the theaters by the time you're listening to this. New Mutants will have already returned to theaters and will have achieved a Rotten Tomatoes score of about 14%. It may be a little bit lower or higher, but definitely not critically acclaimed. And we realize that Wonder Woman is coming out at the beginning of October. Black Widow, who knows what's going to happen with Black Widow at the time we're recording this. Maybe you in the future know what has happened, whether they're going to stream it or whether they're going to put it out in theaters. But what we wanted to make really clear is that Brian and I are not going to a regular movie theater anytime soon over the next 6 months. Because of COVID-19, it is not safe to go to the movie theaters. And I feel like if we review these movies, that it in some way might encourage people listening to go and watch those movies in theaters, and I simply do not want to do that. I think that would be irresponsible of us to talk about these movies unless it's totally safe. And again, there's a possibility Black Widow may come to streaming, but even in that circumstance, it's going to cost about $30 to stream it. And what we're going to do instead next year at some point, when we do Volume 3 of Superhero Pantheon, is we are going to review New Mutants, Wonder Woman, The Old Guard from Netflix, Black Widow, any other superhero movie that has come out. So don't feel like you have to see it if you want to listen to our podcasts. we're going to keep up with the schedule that we determined a few months back, where we talk about some older movies, movies that are already accessible that you don't need to go to the theater to see. And I just think that's really important, because there is no reason, there is no movie that has been released that is worth seeing and risking your life to do. So, I mean, I know that Brian is going to see, or has already seen, New Mutants at a drive-in theater. If you have the opportunity to do that, that's great. But you're going to have to put a pin in it, because we are not going to talk about any of the new superhero releases until sometime next year. But what I can say is there will be an episode of Hero Pantheon. It will be a bonus episode that will be done sometime in December, where we are going to talk about something. I'm not going to say what it is, but there will be one bonus episode of Superhero Pantheon that gets released before the end of the year.
And the drama and suspense builds. So, on that note, thank you for listening to Road Trip Month. This is the end of September, and we go on to next month, where it's post-apocalyptic. We have some zombies, some furious road people, and Donald Pleasant. So, thank you for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Hey Brian, did Chris Terrio and J.J. Abrams get the idea for the dead speaking in the Goofy movie?